What do you think of if someone brings up oldest warship in service? Probably Constitution or Victory, right? Maybe Kamuna if you want to go to the Age of Steel, and stretch the definition of warship for that matter. Not that Connie and Victory don't stretch the definition of in service for their part. That said, you probably don't think of looking to Asia or to submarines, because submarines are generally not the kind of thing you want to keep in service for too long. After all, the older they get, the louder and less capable they become. Nonetheless, the Taiwanese Navy, more formally the Republic of China Navy, has kept 2 World War II-era submarines in service. These boats were relegated to training duty long ago, but they remain in at least limited service so far as I'm aware. And, in the event of a shooting war, they do technically retain the ability to fight. I wouldn't want to be in one of them in that scenario, but the point remains. Let's briefly look at those ships now. The 2 submarines in question began their lives as USS Cutlass and USS Tusk. Cutlass was a Tench-class boat, and Tusk was a Balau. These were already pretty similar boats, with only minor differences, even before their Guppy modernization. Guppy being Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program. A mouthful if there ever was one. Anyway, the major differences between Tench and Balau came down to hull strengthening and a different internal layout on the Tench design. The latter change allowed for carrying 4 more torpedoes. For the purposes of this video, though, Cutlass and Tusk are functionally identical. Both boats displace roughly 1,900 tons on the surface and 2,500 tons submerged. I haven't found details on what their current tonnage is, counting Taiwanese modification. That displacement allowed for 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft. Cutlass could carry up to 28 torpedoes, while Tusk would have been limited to 24. Both boats lost their deck guns in the interest of streamlining, and swapping to torpedoes as the main weapon. As for speed, the submarines lost some surface speed in the Guppy conversion. They could make around 18 knots on the surface, compared to the original 20 to 21 knots. This was balanced out by a far superior submerged speed. This could reach 16 knots, although only for short sprints, compared to a maximum of 9 knots in the original design. Diving performance remained more or less the same, with a test depth around 400 feet or 120 meters. That was something that couldn't really be improved, no matter how much work you did. If these boats can even manage that much nowadays is an open question. In any case, that rounds off the design detail. Now for a brief service history. I'll cover both boats in detail in their own videos. First, let's look at Cutlass. This submarine was laid down on July 22nd, 1944, in Portsmouth Naval Yard. She was launched pretty quickly after this, on November 5th, 1944. Just a couple months of work, which shows how fast American shipyards were pumping these things out. However, the fitting out and working up process would take longer. Cutlass was only commissioned on March 17th, 1945. By this point, the war was largely over. In fact, Cutlass only went on her first war patrol on July 17th, 1945, and the submarine only arrived in her patrol area off the Kurile Islands the day after the Japanese surrender. Poor timing, to be sure, and it means Cutlass never saw combat, despite technically serving in the Pacific War. Her career following this point would be the stereotypical peacetime duty. From 1946 through to 1973, Cutlass was used for patrol, training, and fleet exercise. There weren't any huge events during her career, even by the standards of peacetime service, aside from her Guppy modernization in 1949. Not to say nothing happened, as I'll cover in a dedicated video. It just wasn't particularly exciting. Ultimately, the boat was decommissioned on April 15th, 1973, and almost immediately transferred to Taiwan, which I'll come back to after a brief look at her companion. that being USS Tusk, laid down on August 23, 1943, in Philadelphia. That makes her older than Cutlass if you use date laid down to judge their age. The submarine took substantially longer to complete. Tusk only launched on July 8, 1945, and wouldn't commission until almost a full year later, April 11, 1946, to be specific. As a result, she missed the Second World War entirely. Tusk's entire service was in peacetime, which followed, more or less, the same path as Cutlass. Tusk spent 1946 and 1947 on training duty before going in for refit in October. This involved her own guppy modernization. Pretty quick turnaround, but then Tusk was basically brand new. I'm not surprised the Navy chose her for the modernization work. On the other hand, while it's not mentioned in her fighting ship entry, well, NavSource shows a photo of Tusk after a collision with a hospital ship, which apparently happened coming up to periscope depth and did severe damage to the submarine. The entry also mentions sailing on the surface through a hurricane on the way home, and it was this damage that actually led to the Guppy rebuild, with this supposedly happening in February 1947. There's a second picture on NavSource here, which is marked as pre-October 1947, which matches up with the fighting ship October 1947 refit date. This is, either way, a good case of why you check multiple sources. In any case, Tusk did much the same work as Cutlass. The boat would alternate between the East Coast, often with the submarine school, and European waters, never doing much more than simple training and patrol duty for the most part, with one very notable exception. On August 25, 1949, Tusk was sailing with her sister ship, USS Cochino. This was on a NATO exercise in the North Atlantic, which had gone without issue to this point. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, Cochino suffered a battery explosion. A massive wave had slammed her snorkel so badly that it caused an electrical fire and then the explosion. To the credit of Tusk's crew, they were quick to respond. The submarine sent medical supplies and other aid to help Cochino's injured, despite the fact they were sailing in a gale. They would continue to support the stricken boat until a second explosion forced Cochino's crew to abandon ship. Tusk would take that crew aboard as her sister ship sank. This was a moment of heroism by all accounts. It was also the one moment of real excitement because after this, Tusk returned to the monotony of peacetime duty. She would spend the 1950s and 1960s on quiet roles before being decommissioned on October 18, 1973, and almost immediately transferred to Taiwan to join Cutlass. So, with all of that out of the way, we reach their service in Taiwan. Unsurprisingly, there isn't much detail on this matter. English language sources are pretty non-existent, aside from various news articles. I'll still cover what I've found, but there isn't much here. First off, their new name. Cutlass was renamed to Hai Shi, or Sea Lion. Tusk was renamed to Hai Pao, meaning seal. Under these new names, the submarines were meant for training duty. As part of the transfer agreement, their torpedo tubes were welded shut. They were not intended as combat units, and this was the best way to block that off. In fairness, even in 1973, these boats were of dubious utility as combat units. Nonetheless, without any other submarines to speak of, the Republic of China Navy took those sealed tubes as a challenge. From all indications, shortly after receiving the boats, 1976 is a common date given, the tubes were cut open and restored to operation. As for the torpedoes to use in them, those came from secondary sources. A common example given here is Italy, or alternatively, the Italians acting as a middleman for other nations. Either way, by the middle of the 1970s, the Republic of China Navy had 2 old but operational submarines. Since this is Taiwan we're talking about here, they still have not seen any combat. While details are, again, sparse, From all indications, these subs have spent most of the last 50 years on training. They were probably an important part of Taiwan's defense in the early days. However, by the 1980s, they weren't alone. Two Dutch-designed submarines, the Hai Lung class, had joined the fleet. These were far more capable boats, and I suspect the ex-American subs were relegated fully to training by that point. If not in the 80s, then certainly now in the 2020s. Their condition and capabilities are not great. While finding exact details is difficult, the submarines are rapidly approaching the point where they can't sail. Expensive refurbishment projects in the 2010s served as bandages on lingering issues that can't be fixed. For example, finding spare parts for 80-year-old submarines is not exactly easy, and building new parts is expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, there are persistent claims that the Taiwanese Navy doesn't allow the submarines to submerge out of justifiable fear they'll never come back up. To go along with that is the similar claim that they aren't allowed to operate in water more than 100 meters deep. Things might be worse for the Hai Pao, which is apparently stuck at dock most, if not all, of the time. One online article claims both submarines have warped pressure holes and severe metal fatigue. The usual grain of salt applies there, but it wouldn't surprise me much. These are old ships. When a steel hull reaches 80 years of near-continuous use, I wouldn't be surprised if there were fundamental issues. Structural issues especially so. They've remained in service so long because Taiwan needed them, not because they wanted to keep them around. With this in mind, I don't expect them to last much longer once Taiwan finishes their home-built submarines. At which point, the old World War II boats might be turned into museums. Because, while these submarines are still theoretically capable of combat, I don't think they're at all fit for it. Or, at least, one of them is theoretically capable. The ex-Tusk apparently doesn't even have that. Hopefully, they never have to put that to the test. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.